If you remember when I mentioned on last session that I originally, we were talking about the popes and the papacy today, and I mentioned that I was going to tell you why I originally wanted to do this on February 22nd. I told you I would tell you the following week. Well, of course, I was canceled again for the third time last week. And so I'm a little late in everything. The reason why I would have wanted to do this on February 22nd was because that is the feast of the chair of St. Peter. That feast day commemorates the papacy itself and the unbroken line of the successors of St. Peter. That was my original day I was going to talk about this, but I kept getting pushed back and pushed back because this winter has just been awful as a result. So here we are, a couple weeks late, 1 hour earlier than I would have liked because of daylight savings time. So with that out of the way, why don't we get started? The papacy is a very uniquely Catholic thing. You know, other churches may have bishops, other churches have all our sacraments, but there's only one pope. We used to say there was only one pope at a time, but you know, it's a little different right now. But of course, only Francis is in charge. Benedict is retired. That is true. So, the Pope. The Pope is the Bishop of Rome and the Supreme Pontiff of the Universal Church. And he is the successor of St. Peter. He is the perpetual and visible source and foundation of unity, both of the bishops and of the whole company of the faithful. He is the pastor of the entire church and has full supreme universal power over the entire church, of which he can exercise unhindered at any time. The Pope has many titles. He is referred to as His Holiness, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, Vicar of Christ, Successor of St. Peter, Prince of the Apostles, Supreme Pontiff of the Universal Church, Servant of the Servants of God, the Primate of Italy, the Archbishop and Metropolitan of the Roman Province, the Sovereign of the Vatican City-State. He didn't get those all at once. Those just kind of built up over the years. He was also known as the Patriarch of the West, but Benedict XVI actually dropped that title a couple years ago. Now, the Pope within the Church is a very powerful individual. There are many things he can do on his own. But that power comes from Christ. It was first given to Peter, who we would consider the first pope, although they didn't use that word, and continued through his successors. If you remember on holy orders, you know, the bishops, they would choose successors to carry on their work. And so all of the bishops are considered successors of the apostles, of their office, of their responsibilities, and of their powers. Well, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, is the successor of St. Peter. And we know that St. Peter was the leader of the apostles. He had primacy over all the others. And we know that from Scripture, Jesus gives Peter this special task of being the head, of being the rock. If you don't believe me, we can go through Scripture right now. First, if you look at from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 16, verses 13 to 19. When Jesus went into the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter said in reply, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus said to him in reply, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, For flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my heavenly Father. And so I say to you, you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of the netherworld shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. So what you see here is Peter, because his confession of faith, the first one to really see and recognize Jesus as the true Messiah, Son of the living God. Jesus says, you're no longer Simon, you are now Peter, the rock upon which I will build my church. I'm giving you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Keys were always considered a symbol of authority. And he says, now I'm giving you the keys to the kingdom of heaven. And he gives them the power of binding and loosing. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again, it's that idea of I'm giving you authority. I'm giving you the keys. I'm giving you the power to say yes to this or no to that. Of binding and loosing. That is giving Peter authority. And he gives it, he's not saying this to all the disciples. He's saying this to Peter alone. Now we also read in Luke's Gospel, we read chapter 22, verse 31 to 32. This is at the Last Supper. Jesus says, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has demanded to sift all of you like wheat. But I have prayed that your own faith may not fail. And once you have turned back, you must strengthen your brothers. What you see here is Jesus again, he's addressing Peter. He's addressing him and says, look, your faith is going to be shaken this night. But I pray that it will be strengthened. And then once it is, you need to strengthen the rest of your brothers. If he's going to Peter, he's saying, you're going to be having some doubts right now, but I need you to be strong. I need you to be in charge, to care for the rest of your brethren. Again, he's speaking to Peter. And then finally, from John's Gospel, chapter 21, verse 15 to 17. This is, after the resurrection, this is where Jesus is having breakfast with Peter, John, and a few of the other disciples. And then he says, when they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, feed my lambs. He then said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, tend my sheep. He said to him the third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was distressed that he had said to him a third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. Again, he's addressing Peter here to feed the sheep, to take charge, to be that shepherd, to take care of the church. So the church has always seen Peter as having this special role. And we know that the apostles chose successors to carry on their work. Case in point, you see in Acts of the Apostles, before Pentecost, they're all in the upper room there, and Judas, of course, has betrayed them, left, and he killed himself. And so while they're in the upper room, Peter stands up and he says, basically, we need someone to replace Judas. He was one of us, and even though he betrayed us, we must find someone to fill his office. And so they ultimately chose Matthias to succeed the office where Judas had failed. And so you see there right from the beginning, they did not expect they were special and then their special carriers in their office would just end with them. They knew that others were to eventually take their place. Now, of course, Peter himself, he was considered as the Pope, he was, as the first Pope, also the Bishop of Rome. Now we know, it doesn't say explicitly in Scripture, but we do know that Peter, along with St. Paul, eventually made his way to Rome. And also, along with Paul, helped found the church there. Rome, of course, being the capital of the Roman Empire, basically of the Western world. Peter eventually goes there. He continues to preach there. He founds the church there. He is eventually martyred, dies there, and is buried there. And his tomb is right underneath the altar of St. Peter's Basilica, where it always has been. So we know Peter was there. We know he was the leader amongst all the apostles. We see that even throughout Acts of the Apostles. Peter taking charge. We know he ends up in Rome. And of course, as we know, the apostles had successors. All of them did. So, so the church believes that Peter, having that special charism, also includes his own successors. And that Peter's successor has this universal jurisdiction amongst the entire Christian community. And so, after Peter, his successor was Linus. After Linus was Antiquinas. After Antiquinas came Clement. Now, Clement is important because we have a certain letter from Clement. Clement would be the fourth Bishop of Rome, we would say. And Clement wrote a letter to the church in Corinth. So, in the Bible, we have St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians. Well, we also have a letter of Clement to the Corinthians. And Clement would have lived in the late 1st century. So he would have died, I think, around the year 97 or something of that sort. But he writes a letter to the Corinthians, very much as Paul did, there to kind of solve some problems and to try and end divisions and all that. And in this letter, Clement is writing, and he's saying, he's writing, and part of it is assumed that he is able to write to this community. Now, sometimes people will say that, well, the churches in each community, they would have had their own leaders, their own bishop, but they were basically kind of independent of one another. No church could tell the others what to do. But here we see Clement writing to this letter to the Corinthians saying, as the bishop, as the leader in Rome, I have to step in to solve this crisis, this problem for you, and to give my advice on other things. And it's assumed in the letter that Clement, as Bishop of Rome, has the authority to do this, to intercede, to get into this, to settle this dispute. You would think, well, why did the Bishop of Corinth do this himself? Well, that I don't know. I haven't memorized that letter. It's a very nice letter, though. You should read it at some time. Clement to the Corinthians. So we see this already in the 1st century. The Bishop of Rome is writing to other dioceses, if you will, other churches to help settle disputes. So we see this idea of Bishop of Rome having this power, having this authority over the entire universal church. Now we have also some early church fathers which also help support this position. So St. Irenaeus writes that, and he died around the year 200, so he's writing in the 2nd century. He says, those who wish to see the truth can observe in every church the tradition of the apostles made manifest in the whole world. We can enumerate those who were appointed bishops in the churches by the apostles and their successors down to our day. So Irenaeus is showing that, yes, the apostles had successors with that same authority to carry on the mission of the church. And so he also says, the blessed apostles, having founded and built up the church, handed over the office of the episcopate to Linus, To him succeeded Anacletus, and after him, in the third place from the apostles, Clement was chosen for the episcopate. So you have Irenaeus showing the line of the official successors of St. Peter. And again, in Clement's letter to the Corinthians, he's showing in his tone, he treats the church order as a vital matter. And in the end of his letter, he does invoke the authority of the Roman church. But he doesn't say why or how he has that authority. It's assumed to the people he's writing to, they already know he has the power and authority to do this, to write this letter, to give these corrections and his advice. So it's already there at this time, already at the end of the first century. So what is it that the Pope is able to do? What is his powers? What are his responsibilities? Well, the Pope has what we would call primacy. And primacy means this. This was mostly defined at the First Vatican Council, which would have been in the year 1870. And so the Vatican Council there declared that we therefore teach and declare, according to the testimony of the gospel, that the primacy of jurisdiction over the whole church was immediately and directly promised and conferred upon the blessed apostle Peter by Christ the Lord. And so the succession of Peter and the primacy of jurisdiction is by divine right. It's not a church law, it's a divine law given by Christ himself, and not just a mere human development. And the papal jurisdiction refers to the Pope's power to teach and govern the universal church and to call for obedience from believers, which is necessary to carry out the mission of serving the entire church community. And because the Pope is head of the College of Bishops, his power of jurisdiction is also a primacy of jurisdiction. So all the bishops of the world are successors of the apostles. The College of Bishops make up a teaching body, but that College of Bishops must be in union with the successor of Peter. It must be in union with the Bishop of Rome, whom we call the Pope. Now, that papal authority is said to be supreme, full, episcopal, immediate, ordinary, and universal. And here's what that means. The Pope's power is supreme in that no one on earth can overrule. It is full in that he shares it with no one. It is immediate since he needs nobody to speak for him. It is universal because it is not limited by any territorial boundaries or limited to certain categories of persons. It is ordinary because it has not been delegated to the Pope by anyone else. It comes directly from Jesus Christ. So, the Pope has a lot of power, but he can't do anything he wants. See, the Pope can change any ecclesiastical or church law, but the things he cannot change are divine law. He cannot change natural law. So, for example, the sacraments, our 7 sacraments, were instituted by Christ himself. The Pope can't change that. He can't say, oh, we're going to take away this sacrament, or we're going to add an 8th sacrament. He can't do that. He cannot deny the divine law that all life is sacred. He can't say, well, only some of the life is sacred. It doesn't matter about this or that. Or adultery, nah, let's change the teaching on that. Let's say it's not a commandment anymore. Or yeah, let's reduce the 10 commandments. Let's only use 8 of them. I don't like 2 of them. The Pope can't do that. He cannot change divine law. He cannot change the natural law. He can change church law. He can change the discipline or the way things are carried out. That he has full power to do. That power of binding and loosing, having the keys, that authority to do so. but he cannot change God's law. Not even he can do that. And so the power of the Pope extends to every single church, every parish, every bishop across the entire world. The Pope can appoint bishops, he can depose bishops, he can call councils, he can make and unmake laws, he can send missionaries, he can confer distinctions and privileges, he can dispense with things. The Pope is the supreme judge. He is basically the final authority, all in one person. The Pope is the teacher of all Christians. He's the chief shepherd and shepherd of their flocks. And the word Pope itself is derived from the Latin term Papa, which basically means father. And so that's what basically the Pope means. He's just called the Father. That's why he'll have the title the Holy Father. The Papa, the Dad, the Father. Now, a very familial term used for him. And the Pope is independent of every temporal sovereign and of every spiritual power. He is responsible only to God. Now, sometimes popes in history would take that a little bit too far of what they could and could not do. And we'll see that a little bit later. The Pope is also head of the Vatican city-state. He is, as soon as you're elected, you become the de facto ruler of Vatican City. It's a very small country, only about 108 acres, but it's a country nonetheless. And he is the ruler of said country. And now there's also the issue of papal infallibility. This one, people always seem to be confused about this one. People sometimes often think the Pope can literally say nothing wrong. Whatever he says is gospel truth. No matter what he says, no matter what his opinion on is, if the Pope says it, it's true. If the Pope says the sky is green, then the sky is green. That's not what papal infallibility is about. Papal infallibility was, again, not invented at Vatican I, it was defined at Vatican I. Again, this was in 1870. Papal infallibility basically says that the Pope, through special grace of his office, cannot err in official statements of faith and teaching. We say that the Pope, and when he does this, he speaks ex cathedra, from the chair, literally, from the chair of Peter. And so the Pope can make official pronouncements of faith and doctrine on his own, without the rest of the bishops, without a council. The Pope can do this on his own. And it has been rarely used. Last time it was used, I believe, was 1950, when Pope Pius XII declared the dogma of the Assumption of Mary. Before that, it was used in 1854 under Pius IX, when he declared the dogma of the Immaculate Conception. Again, it's something that is rarely used, but as successor of Peter, he has that special grace where he can make these official pronouncements, official declarations, and we believe as a special grace of the Holy Spirit, he cannot err when he does that. But the Holy Spirit prevents him from officially teaching something incorrect in terms of doctrine and dogma. Does that prevent them from sinning? No. Can that prevent the Pope from having bad opinions? No. The Pope, as a human being, as a fallen person who needs the mercy and forgiveness of God for salvation, he is still human. He can have bad opinions. He can make mistakes. He can produce bad judgments on things. He can maybe create burdensome or unjust laws within the church and practices. But when it comes to officially teaching doctrine and dogmas of the faith, we believe he has that special grace to not err. And that's a special grace of the Holy Spirit to keep the church on the right track, to keep it free from doctrinal error. The Pope is still human. He can still make mistakes. If the Pope said, I say that the sky is green, I would call him out on it. I would write a very polite letter to him, maybe. Or maybe send something to him on Twitter. I don't know. Pope, I think you got this one wrong. He would not pronounce that ex cathedra, not declaring that statement. I don't know why he would, anyways. So that is the power, the abilities of the popes, of all of them. Now again, over time, it takes time as much as like with any of the developments in the church to have a better understanding and to see how these powers work and how we define them. So what I thought I'd do right now is just kind of go through a couple of the popes of history. There have been about 266 of them. So a good amount. I'm not going to go through all of them. But I'm just going to highlight a couple of certain ones and just see what made their papacy important or how it influenced things they did right, things they did wrong. So of course, the church recognizes as the first pope, St. Peter. And traditionally, he is believed to have been the longest serving pope, around 30-some years. So he was always the leader of the apostles, although of course he did not start in Rome. He ended up in Rome and helped establish the church there, and his successors continued to be the bishop of Rome. We talked about Clement a little bit, the fourth bishop of Rome. He died in the year 97. We talked a little bit about his letter to the Corinthians and why that was very significant. Pope Sylvester, he lived during the time of Constantine, so around the year 320s and the 330s. He's significant because he's the first pope under Constantine when Christianity was legalized, the persecutions ended. And he and his successors, Constantine kind of gave a small bit of land where the popes could live. It was this place called the Lateran. It was donated, it was basically from a family known as the Lateran family, and they donated this land. They eventually built a church on that property in Rome, which is today known as St. John Lateran's Church, which is the Cathedral of Rome. St. Peter's is not the Cathedral of Rome. St. John Lateran is the Cathedral of Rome. That is the cathedral. That's where the chair, that's where the cathedra there, the chair is at St. John's Lateran. And for a long part of the history, the popes used to live there. At one point, I forget when, the popes began to live at St. Peter's residence at the Vatican, where St. Peter's Basilica was. When that was, I don't know. But eventually he moved there, and he continues to live there to this day. And so now so let's jump ahead a little bit to Pope Leo the Great. He reigned as Pope from 440 to 461. He's famous for a couple of reasons. This was towards the end of the Roman Empire. This is when, continuing barbarian attacks from the north. The empire is shrinking. It's beginning to fracture. Most of the administration and talent had long since moved to Constantinople a century earlier. And so one of the famous stories with Leo is Attila the Hun is threatening Rome to attack the city. And Rome had already been sacked about 30-some years earlier. And it was pretty bad for everyone. And so Pope Leo, he goes out to Attila to basically kind of say, could you turn around and not come attack us? And until it did, through the help of Leo, he helped convince him to not attack the city of Rome. It's a very famous story. Leo became famous for that. But Leo was also famous for his defense of the Orthodox true Catholic faith. At this time, there's still a lot of debates on the nature of God, the nature of Jesus. And there was an issue with the nature of Christ. Does he just have a divine nature? Does he have a human nature? Is it just one or the other, or is it both? And so the Council of Chalcedon was going on at the time, and Leo himself did not go to it, but he sent his legates, his representatives, to go for him, to represent him. And he brought along with him, and he sent on something called the Tome of Leo, which was a wonderful teaching and work on the defense of the two natures of Christ, that Jesus Christ had a human and divine nature within one divine person. So he sends his tome, and when this tome was read at the council, it said that the council fathers all spoke and said, Peter has spoken through Leo. Not only did Leo have this great defense of the true natures of Christ, but they also there recognize that Leo is in fact the successor of Peter as Bishop of Rome. That's what they say. Peter has spoken through Leo. So that's one of the reasons why he's important. Fast forward about 150 years, and we get to another great, St. Gregory the Great. Now, when St. Gregory was elected Pope, the Rome itself was a mess. The Western Empire was gone. Completely collapsed, civil disorder everywhere. It was not a fun time to be around. And so what you see here is really the strengthening of the papacy, of papal power in the affairs of the world. Not just the affairs of the church, but into civil affairs, into temporal affairs. Partially because at this time, there was no real other institution able to handle all this. And so Gregory was one of those people who really began to use the church and use his own position as Bishop of Rome to help bring stability to Europe, to the Western world. Now Gregory himself, he was an administrator in Rome for some time in his younger years, but he wanted to be a monk. He wanted to do the contemplative life. So he basically stepped down, I think he was a deacon, and he went to become a monk. Well, around 590, they needed to elect a new pope, a new bishop of Rome, and they knew that Gregory was still around. People still remembered him from his administrative days, and so they elected him. Said, Gregory, we want you to be the pope. Well, he was kind of reluctant because, and as he wrote in one of his letters, I kind of don't like this because I'm so busy with administration and this and that I'd rather go back to my contemplative life, my life as a monk. But he knew he was needed, and so he accepted the call to be elected Pope, Bishop of Rome, and so he was. And so he was Pope from 590 to 604. And he was the one who came up with the phrase referring to himself as the servant of the servants of God. That he was truly there. His responsibility was to serve the church to the best of his capacity. He was not there to rule, he was there to serve. And he did. He sent many missionaries out to attempt to re-evangelize areas. Famous was he sent Augustus of Canterbury to Canterbury, England, to help evangelize the British, the Angles there. The Angles weren't there yet, but he sent him to England to help evangelize there. He sent other missionaries out. He also helped provide for the city of Rome itself to help provide food and shelter and just works of charity. Because Rome at that time was basically a shell of its former self. And so he did all these great works of really using the church resources to help, again, send missionaries out, to help reestablish churches, to help reestablish civility and structure to Europe. That's why he is known as the Great. He was also one of those people who was proclaimed a saint by popular acclaim at the very moment of his death. So now let's fast forward about another 450 years to another Gregory. This is Gregory the Seventh, sometimes known as Hildebrand. He was a reformer. He sought to reform the church. There was a lot of bad practices at the time, one of which was clerics would be buying offices, so they would buy their way to the priesthood or buy their way to be bishops. He was working to put a stop to these abuses. He was working to stop lay investiture, where basically the people say who the bishop are and not the clergy themselves. And so he did a lot of reforms to help curb these abuses within the church itself. He was also very powerful. At this time, we're in the Middle Ages now, Gregory the Seventh is ruling from 1073 to 1085. So we're in the height of the Middle Ages here. And Gregory was one of those who could literally bring kings and emperors to their knees. Papacy had become very powerful, very much concerned in temporal affairs at this time. So what happens? There's this issue with the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV over the appointment of bishops. Long story short, the two have a big disagreement, Henry and Gregory. So Henry says, Gregory, you're deposed as Pope. Gregory says, well, you're excommunicated. Well, what ends up happening is Henry's the one who gives in. And so he actually begs the Pope to lift the excommunication. He's actually out in the snow on his knees for 3 days as an act of penance. Gregory does, in fact, lift the excommunications, although they would still have issues with one another. But it shows at this time already the temporal power of the Pope. He already owns a bunch of lands. This is known as the Papal States, which was its own country up till 1870. And it shows us his power even over kings and emperors. Now, some popes would use that power for good use, like Gregory VII did, in terms of using reforms and putting a stop to abuses. Sometimes the popes would use that to their own personal ends, abuse that power. Move forward another 100 years or so to Pope Innocent III. He's Pope from 1198 to 1216. He is considered the most powerful Pope in terms of papal power in the world. He was a brilliant mind. In fact, he was elected young. He was 37 when he was elected Pope. But a brilliant mind. And people would say maybe they didn't love him, but they certainly respected him. His mind, his ability, and his power. So, what were the things he would do? Innocent says that the church as a spiritual power is greater than the temporal powers. And as a result, he can interfere and he can get involved in temporal affairs because he, as the spiritual leader of the church, is therefore greater as any king or emperor, anyone who just has temporal power. Because the spiritual power is more important, is greater than the temporal power. So, what does he do? Well, again, he does a lot of reforms. He helps call the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, which was a very good counsel in terms of reforms and church practices. But he was not afraid to use his papal power to go against the kings or who he felt the kings were wronging. So, for example, there's an issue with King John of England over appointment of bishops and clerics. And the clergy was upset that basically King John was going against them, appointing whoever he wanted as bishops and abbots and clerics, and not the clergy itself. Now this is the same King John who would end up signing the Magna Carta in England. So this is the early 1200s, same guy. So the issue gets brought to Rome. Innocent says, all right, I'm going to issue an interdict against England, against King John. An interdict is a mass excommunication of the entire country. That means no sacraments except baptisms and funerals can be said. So you can baptize, you can have funerals, but you can't even have mass. That is an interdict. And he used it against England. Basically to say, you were the king, you were the ruler of these people. If you're not going to fall in the line, then everyone's going to be affected by it. Because now I'm issuing this interdict. Mass excommunication of the entire country. Of course, the idea is that's supposed to put pressure on the king, because of course now all the regular people, the citizens, they're going to be upset. And so that's the idea, is to put pressure on the king, the ruler, to say, look, you're in the wrong here. The Pope, we're getting hurt by this too. Just go along with the Pope says, basically. And of course that eventually works against King John. Another example, King Philip Augustus of France. At one point in time, he basically said, I don't care for my wife anymore. I'm going to start sleeping with my mistress, and I don't care who knows about it. So he did this openly and just kind of threw his wife aside. So Pope Innocent threatens with an interdict, and the king says, okay, I'll go back to my wife. Sorry, don't want to cause any trouble. That was the power, that was the height of papal power. Now, I do want to talk about this. There's an issue in the church known as the Great Western Schism. And this was an interesting time. This was when authority was very fragmented, and this was just bad for everyone. So here's the background. Here's what happened. 1305, a French pope is elected, Clement V. Now, the French king invites him to stay at Avignon, France. And so he does. And so basically, the pope moves out of Rome, moves to Avignon, France. And his successors continue to live there. This was known as the Avignon Papacy, or as the Romans called it, the Babylonian Captivity, because the Bishop of Rome was not in Rome. He kept living in France. And part of the idea was, well, Avignon, this is a new place. It's basically a resort town. Things are great there. Rome, however, is not a great place to live. It's a dirty city. Most of it is abandoned and in ruins still. Most of it's destroyed. Why would I want to live there? And so the popes continued to do that up until the year 1370, when finally Gregory XI, with the help of St. Catherine of Siena, is finally convinced to return to Rome. Well, after his death, the people of Rome saying, okay, enough of that. We want no more of these French popes who are going to go live in France. We want a Roman, or at the very least, an Italian pope. We want him now, before another French pope is elected. So the cardinals quickly elect a new pope, Urban VI. Well, as it turns out, he proved so unpopular that some of these same cardinals said, okay, maybe we made a mistake. This guy's not working out. We're just going to elect a new guy. Someone else anyways. All while Urban VI is still alive, mind you. They said, okay, just forget it. were electing someone else. This, of course, caused a schism, because this new elected pope went back to Avignon, went back to France. So now you have two popes in the church saying, well, we're the legitimate pope. We were both elected by these same cardinals. So now you have these popes different to different groups. Countries are loyal to different popes, either the French one or the Roman one. Big schism, political mess. And so they keep electing successors. And this continues on. So in 1409, the factions meet in the city of Pisa to help end the schism. So they said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're just going to elect a new pope, and the other two will step down. So it starts off okay. They elect a new pope, except the other two refuse to step down. So now there are 3 popes in the church, each one saying, I'm the legitimate one. Thankfully, 5 years later, 1414 at the Council of Constance, the Pope, the original John the 23rd, who was considered an anti-pope, we'll go over that later, and the Roman Pope agreed to resign, that they will step down, we'll elect a new guy, and that will put an end to this. So those two agree to step down. Martin V is elected as the legitimate successor. Now the French Pope refused to step down, but they simply excommunicated him. And that basically put an end to the Western Schism. We finally had legitimate Pope, we're back to one again, and the church recognized that the successors of Urban VI, the guy who was originally elected back in 1370, him and his successors were considered to be the legitimate line of popes. Everyone else were the anti-popes. Quick word on that, on the anti-popes. Anti-popes were basically anyone who challenged, who said they had a claim that they were the true pope, that they were the legitimate successor, when in fact they weren't. They weren't exactly bad people, they just thought they were the legitimate successor. The first one was back in from 217, Hippolytus. Him and his faction felt that he should be the legitimate successor. The true pope said no. There was some battling between the two. But ultimately he was reconciled with the church. Others were not. And so the Great Western Schism showed when that was just at its worst. To where you had 2 popes and then you had 3 popes. And it really hurt the prestige and legitimacy of the papacy amongst other people. Now, we are running out of time. Just a few more popes I wanted to talk about. So real briefly, just a couple of other popes. There was Julius II, pope between 1503 and 1513. He was a classic Renaissance pope. He commissioned the new St. Peter's Basilica. He had Michelangelo paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. He was also aggressive in expanding papal territory. He was also known as the warrior pope because he would actually go into battle. He would actually be there at the battlefront with his armies. And he was very much a temporal, secular guy. And it was said that when he was near death, someone said, "What are you going to do if St. Peter doesn't let you in?" And he said, "Then I'll storm the gates." That's the kind of man he was. And then real quick, you have under Pius IX. He was a very long-serving pope from 1846 to 1878. He called the First Vatican Council, but at this time, papal power was waning, the temporal power. The Italian unification under Garibaldi was gaining strength. He had been working to unite Italy, and parts of Rome were the last place. Well, in 1870, they finally captured the city of Rome, which means the Pope lost his temporal power completely. He lost all of his lands. And so he considered him, Pius IX, and his successors considered themselves prisoner of the Vatican. They were basically trapped at their home at St. Peter's Basilica in that little Vatican territory. That he had no more land. Power was gone. And this would continue up until 1929, when they finally answered what was known as the Roman question. What do you do about Pope? Something was signed called the Lateran Treaty in 1929, which established the Vatican City-State, that 108 acres. They were established, they were given 750 million lira as a reparation, and that is how the Vatican City-State is to this day. So that the Pope actually has this tiny little piece of land to call his own. And that is just basically a basic overview of the Pope, the papacy, powers of the Pope, and some of the popes throughout history. We are about 11 minutes before 11 o'clock Mass, and I must be there to preach today. So unfortunately, I cannot answer any questions today. But I will allow you, when we go next week, I'll give you the chance to ask any questions concerning the papacy or the popes at that time. As for the topic for next week, I'm still working on that because all of those days we got canceled has really thrown off my schedule. So thank you for your patience. You'll be surprised on the topic for next week, so show up anyways. It'll be a good one, I guarantee it. Bring your questions next week, and thank you.